All right, well, thank you all for coming today. It's really nice to see a room full of people. Even though it's summer, I appreciate you showing up. We really appreciate especially Sarah's father making the trip out from Ohio for the defense today. And I hope it's an exciting afternoon for everybody. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Sarah Winnicki. She came to K-State from finishing an impressive double bachelor's, both Bachelor of Science in Biology as well as a Bachelor of History from Denison University in 2016, and she got all the honors you could imagine at that point in her career, and started her master's in my program in the fall of 2016. But actually, Sarah's involvement in our lab goes back to 2014 because she came here initially as an RU student and fell in love with the prairie and the grasshopper, sparrows, and other birds that we were studying there. So much so that she came back for a second RU summer in 2015 and then ended up applying to the graduate program the next year. She has, over the course of her time at K-State, has probably gotten more awards than, certainly more awards than I have. She came to the program with a prestigious graduate research fellowship from National Science Foundation. She's gotten internal awards from the Division of Biology, the Accord Award, university level awards, such as the Science Communication Award this year. She received Sigma Xi Grant and Aid of Research at the national level, many presentation awards. She's presented numerous times at conferences, 11 times since she came to K-State. She has, her outcome of that original RU project is in the final stages of revision for ecology. So she has a manuscript almost out, and then 3 publications will result from this master's. So impressive record of research and productivity. She's also been to the poster child for science communication at the university, and has been very active in regional, local events, and even national events, so that she's been featured in Audubon magazine. She was invited to give a keynote talk for the Ohio Young Birders Conference, and is well known through her Twitter presence far and wide. So it's a great pleasure to turn it over to Sarah and let her tell you about this impressive body of work that she's done during her time as a master's student.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to kill these slides real fast. All right. So as Alice mentioned, this is 3 chapters worth of data about growth and development of grassland songbirds. So across living things, we see a diversity in growth and development strategies. So organisms develop at different rates. They require different amounts of parental investment, parental care. And we know that this diversity has consequences. We know that this impacts organisms' survival, their reproduction, their life history strategies. And we understand this relationship relatively well. What we don't necessarily understand is what environmental drivers gave rise to this diversity in growth and development in the first place. And understanding this connection is particularly important because as environments change, we could see changes in growth and development that then have changes for these birds' survival, reproduction, life history. A great system with which to address questions about diversity and growth and development are birds in general. Birds are wonderful, and you have birds like these cute little ducklings that we call precocial because they hatch out of eggs with feathers. Within a few hours, they're running around, ready to go, they're super cute. On the other end of that spectrum, we have altricial birds, like the birds that we study, which hatch out pink and helpless, totally dependent on their parents, particularly ugly. And so we have this range between species, which is, again, why birds are a great place to start when looking at diversity and growth and development. So these little birds that we study grow up remarkably fast. So the sparrows will, hatch out of their egg and within 8 days look almost like little adults, and they'll be out in the prairie, out of their nest. In order to in that 8 days, they have to go through these different developmental milestones, right? They need to hatch, which is really energetically expensive. They need to open their eyes. They need to grow their bones and other structural components of their body. They need feathers both for thermoregulation, so their body feathers, but also feathers to fly. They need to gain mass overall and develop flight muscles and other muscles for locomotion once they leave the nest. If a human child grew that quickly, they would look like this in a week. They'd be 4 foot tall, they would weigh 70 pounds. And so this is, again, remarkably fast growth and development that we're seeing here on our prairie. So we know from previous work that nesting development strategies differ in growth rate. So sparrows and meadowlarks, 2 different species here on the prairie, they accomplish this growth to the point of leaving the nest at different rates. So sparrows can accomplish the growth in 7 days. Meadowlarks will take longer, like 12 or 13. So we know that growth rate itself varies. We also know that they vary in what we call prioritization. So if you're a developing organism, you have a limited energy budget to dedicate to the growth of different parts of your body. And there isn't a set route that you need to take to use that energy. So you don't have to develop your legs first and then your muscles or something like that. So you can allocate energy in different ways to prioritize the growth of one structure over another. So for instance, this meadowlark baby on top, you can see it has really, really long legs, but it isn't very alert. It's kind of laying there, it's alive, I promise. But its eyes are closed, it's not like ready to escape at all. The sparrow has relatively shorter legs, but it is already alert. It's clearly prioritizing the development of that like alertness, its eyes, more than the meadowlark is, potentially at the cost of something like overall mass gain or the development of other structures. So that's what we mean by prioritization, is growing one part faster than another. And finally, these birds can vary in fledge age, or the age that they leave the nest. So you can see in our kind of grainy video, the meadowlark is taking off, going out into the prairie. So previous studies have observed this variation in either growth rate, prioritization, or fledge age between different species. So between a meadowlark and a sparrow, between different populations of the same species. So for instance, birds growing in California might be different from conspecifics in Alaska. But we were starting to notice it right here at Kanza. So as Alice mentioned, we did some work here prior to my master's. I started to notice when I went to band these birds that they look really different at the same age. So we go and we put these little aluminum bands on birds' legs when they're about 6 days old. Sometimes the 6-day-old birds look like this. Sometimes they look almost like they're adults. So we're seeing, not only between species variation, but also this intraspecific variation at an individual site, which really hasn't been recorded before for birds. We're expecting that might also be happening within nests, that siblings may be growing differently from each other as well. So we have this observed variation in growth and development here in the songbirds at Kanza. What are the drivers of that variation? So in birds, we know that food matters. So the amount of food that a nestling receives will affect how it grows, because more food is more energy, is more growth. These birds can prioritize body parts to help them gain food, especially if they're competing with other nestlings. So as you can see, this nestling had to reach up really tall to get that food from its parent. Its other siblings did not. So maybe prioritizing something like that vertical height by growing really long legs would help in situations where the birds are competing for food. Alternatively, or in addition to the food driver, we know that birds respond to predator risk. So if you're growing and developing in an area that has a lot of predators, you would want to leave the nest earlier than birds that are developing in safer areas. So we see that birds in safe cavities don't leave the nest as quickly as birds on the grounds, like our sparrows at Kanza. But what hasn't been assessed is the effect of this breeding system called brood parasitism on the growth and development of birds. So this is our native brown-headed cowbird. This is a species of blackbird that lives in Kansas. So instead of taking all the energy to build a nest and to incubate those eggs and to raise those nestlings, brown-headed cowbirds instead lay their eggs in other species' nests. So this nest should be filled with blue dickcissel eggs, but instead there's an additional 5 cowbird eggs in that nest. We had expected from previous studies that these cowbirds are replacing dickcissel eggs. So they come in and they grab a dickcissel egg, they knock it out of the nest, and then they add a cowbird egg. So that's how we assumed this was working. I'll get more on that later. These nestlings, these cowbird nestlings will hatch. They often grow faster than their competitors. So this large nestling here is a cowbird. These are two little sparrows. You could see how this would, lead to some competition for food in the nest if those tiny sparrows are competing with a fast-growing large cowbird baby. Consequently, these cowbirds do relatively well. So we see a lot of them here on the prairie, growing and developing. And that can be a cost for both these nestlings that are competing and also for parents who have to provide for these nestlings that not only require a lot of food and attention, but can also become much larger than they are. So this is the adult here, an adult Wilson's warbler, trying to feed a very large cowbird baby. Cowbirds are interesting not only because they have this neat breeding system, but also because we've seen this amazing range spread over the last few centuries. So cowbirds were initially just in the Great Plains region. They used to be called bison birds. They fell around bison. But over, since the 1800s, they've expanded to the east and west coast and up into Canada. And here in Kansas, we have quite a few of them, as you can see from the photo that I took in western Kansas. As those cowbirds have spread to the east and west coast, they're encountering some species that have never been in contact with brood parasites before. So something like the Kirtland's warbler or the black-headed vireo, these birds are already endangered, and then they're facing this threat from these cowbirds and facing such costs from the cowbirds that researchers will actually capture and kill cowbirds in the area. So understanding these interactions with hosts and parasites are important, not only because they're cool, but also because they do impact some endangered species. So, like I said, we haven't really thought about brood parasitism in terms of nestling growth and development before, especially in terms of this intraspecific growth and development, because folks hadn't really seen intraspecific growth and development before. So the whole point of my project was basically just asking how this brown-headed cowbird brood parasitism affects the growth and development of nestlings. So worked out at Kansa, which obviously is a lovely site for any work, but also for working on brood parasites, because about 50% of the nests at Kansa include at least one cowbird egg. So this is like the second highest parasitism rate ever recorded for the brown-headed cowbird. The majority of our nests that are parasitized actually contain more than one cowbird egg, up to 9. So a great place to study cowbirds. We study them in 3 different host species. So the largest host is the eastern meadowlark. These birds, once they're adults, are about 3 times the size of brown-headed cowbirds. Their eggs are much larger. So here we have 2 big meadowlark eggs, tiny little cowbird eggs, and the nestlings themselves are larger too. So in this nest, they're nicely camouflaged, but you can see this little bird is the cowbird baby, and then these 2 are the larger meadowlark nestlings. So when I talk about meadowlarks, I'm going to try to use some shade of purple and include the little meadowlark icon to keep track of all this data. Second host we studied was the dickcissel. So this is a species that's about the same size as the cowbirds once they're adults. They lay these bright blue eggs. They're parasitized the most frequently. And as you can see, the nestlings are approximately the same size too. So this little grayish cowbird inside is about the same size as the 2 brownish colored dickcissel nestlings. Finally, our last host is the grasshopper sparrow. These birds are substantially smaller than the cowbird, maybe half the size of cowbirds once they're adults. They get parasitized as frequently as the meadowlarks do. You see 5 sparrow eggs here, 1 cowbird egg, and they can be substantially smaller than the cowbird parasites. So that large nestling in my hand is a cowbird. The small nestling is the sparrow with which it's competing. So I'll try to use some shade of blue when referencing grasshopper sparrows. The biggest work that we have to do for this project is just finding these nests. So we spend most of our time nest searching. So this is a picture I took less than 10 centimeters from the front of a nest, and you can still barely see those eggs in the background. So most of our time we look for nests. Once we find them, we check in and wait until they hatch. I go to the nest every other day and take some measurements of the nestlings as they develop. We took over 30 measurements, not all of them necessarily on every single nestling, so I'm going to focus on the ones that we did. I looked at leg length, what we call a tarsus, so from here to here on nestlings. Gape, so this is like the width of their open mouth, so from one corner to the other. We took photos of their wings and then used image J to analyze the lengths of their wing bones and their feathers and the parts of their feathers that are starting to unsheathe. We looked at their body feathers. We looked at things like their eye development and their activity development, and then finally took their mass. On a subset of the nest, we put some nest cameras up. And so these are little camouflage bullet cameras that sit right in front of the nest and record 24/7 slightly grainy footage of these birds and their parents. So over the 2 years, we found 284 nests. Only 148 of those made it to the nestling stage. The rest were eaten before that. Out of those nests, I measured 316 nestlings, and that group I measured over 800 times. We recorded over 6,000 hours of nest footage, which is about 8.7 months of continuous footage, which is a lot. And that was only at 53 nests, which will be important later. And like we expected, based on our observations of sparrows, we found substantial interspecific variation at the site. So a meadowlark, by the time it leaves the nest, can be as little as 30 grams or as heavy as 50 grams. So a lot of variation between nestlings of the same species at the same age. So again, we just wanted to look at what the effect of brood parasitism was on that variation. So we predicted that, these nestlings could be experiencing current competition from these cowbirds. They could be growing more slowly because the cowbirds are getting more of the food. So you kind of expect the nestlings on the bottom edge of that growth curve to be the ones in parasitized nests. This could depend on host species size. So if you are a meadowlark, you're probably not facing as steep of competition from those little cowbirds as you are if you're a tiny sparrow and the cowbirds are substantially larger than you. But again, these birds all evolved together on the prairie. So there's reason to expect that they might have found some ways to adapt to the presence of these cowbirds and may instead be experiencing some effects of past competition and some adaptation to these cowbirds. And so they could be growing and developing in the exact same way because parents are compensating. So maybe when a cowbird is present, the parents bring more food, or maybe they incubate slightly differently, something like that, so that these birds aren't experiencing any cost as nestlings. Alternatively, they may be prioritizing growth of traits that influence competition. So maybe if you're a nestling up against that giant cowbird, you'll prioritize long legs so that you can stand up and compete with that cowbird. And that would allow you to still grow alongside these cowbirds with little consequence otherwise. Finally, they could leave the nest early. So this competition happens in the nest cup. So if you're facing such steep competition in the nest that you can't keep up, leaving the nest at an earlier stage or at an earlier date might help you respond to these cowbirds. So to test these, we ran some linear mixed models. We looked at the growth of individual nestlings over time, so held that as a random effect. And then we expected that nestlings would be, as they're genetically similar, would be similar to their siblings in the nest. So we ran nest as a random effect. We looked at a few different response variables. We had taken all these measurements, and we wanted to basically just know how the birds differed in size. So we ran a principal components analysis and had one dimension that basically just explained how big the nestling was. So that was our first response variable. And then we ran a second response variable on the prioritization of these competitive features. I'll dig into that a little bit more later. But we looked first at the effects of some of the other known drivers of development, like the number of host eggs or nestlings or year or sex on these nestling size or prioritization. Most influential, of course, was age. So nestlings are bigger when they're older. So every single effect we're looking at, we had to account for an interaction with age. So just keep that in mind. And then we contrasted that then with the effect of cowbirds. We looked at the number of cowbird nestlings, the number of cowbird eggs, parasitism as a yes/no, the number of total nestlings, basically any way we could think of to measure cowbirds. And then we ran some competing models, and I'll show you the results of the top models. So we found that meadowlark size varied, but that was best explained by the year. So the birds that hatched in 2017 were a little bit smaller when they hatched, but ultimately caught up to the size of the birds that grew in 2018. No strong effect of the presence of cowbirds in this large host species. Dixisels, we found an effect of sex. So they're sexually dimorphic as adults. They also are as nestlings, where females grew just a little bit slower than males overall. We did, in fact, find an effect of cowbirds on these dixisels. So dixisel growth in general was suppressed by the presence of cowbirds, but only when there were many cowbirds in the nest. So if there's one cowbird, they grew just like their conspecifics that weren't in a nest with cowbirds. But if there are two or more, we saw an effect on growth. And so it looks as if these dickcissels can compensate for the presence of one cowbird, but it may just be the addition of more nestlings that's the problem. Finally, grasshopper sparrows, our smallest hosts. The only thing that affected their size overall was the number of nestlings in the brood. This didn't count cowbirds, so the nestlings in the kind of average, medium-sized broods grew a little slower than the ones in very large or very small broods. But again, no effect on the growth of sparrows from those cowbirds. So, we had looked for competition present and past. We did find that dickcissels grow more slowly, but only when they experience very high rates of parasitism, many nestlings in the nest. We found that growth and development for meadowlarks and sparrows was not really affected by the presence of cowbirds, so potentially these parents are compensating. And we didn't find that this was dependent on the host species size, as we would expect the sparrows to have the highest cost. So the fact that our middle size competitor was the one that experienced the cost of current competition was surprising. So next we're going to move into that second response variable, and this is the prioritization of different body parts. So we wanted to see if they're growing one body part faster than another. So we took every measurement of any body part, like the length of their leg or the length of their wing, and divided that by mass to account for their overall size. And then we ran species-specific principal components analysis to identify which, which dimensions of this variation were describing these different prioritization. So meadowlarks prioritize their wing and their bone growth. So higher values are larger wings and bones relative to mass, but in the smallest and largest broods, but not in the average medium-sized broods. So no effective cowbirds in these large hosts again. Dickcissels in parasitized nests actually prioritize their gait less. So we expected that they'd grow a larger gait to get more food when they're competing with cowbirds. In fact, we saw the opposite effect here. Finally, grasshopper sparrows, once again, it was just brood size that affected their growth. So they had longer wings relative to mass in large broods. So, we did not find that these birds are prioritizing the growth of traits influencing competition when we looked at them in this principal components analysis. Finally, our last potential is that these birds are leaving the nest early. So we modeled fledge age, again, using some linear mixed models with nestling of D as random effect, age as a random effect, and then looked at the effects of size. So did the larger birds leave earlier? Did the ones that are prioritizing, their mass or whatever those principal components were for each species, did they leave earlier? Or did the parasitized birds leave earlier? And we found that meadowlarks and parasitized nests did fledge earlier. So these birds were leaving the nest around day 7 instead of the average of 10.5. Although you notice we have a small sample size of parasitized meadowlarks that fledged. But this was a very significant difference. These birds are leaving at substantially different times. Interestingly though, their mass when they leave the nest at day 6, so those early leaving birds, was about the same as conspecifics in nests without cowbirds. So these birds weren't any larger, they weren't growing any faster to leave the nest earlier. They were leaving the nest at an earlier stage in their development, potentially to get away from these cowbird competitors. So we found evidence that they leave the nest earlier. So overall, we found that competition is still affecting dickcissels, but that we do see some ways that these birds are compensating for the presence of cowbirds, either through parental behavioral changes or leaving the nest early. So kind of counter to our expectations, these cowbirds are having little effect via direct competition. We see some species-specific responses to the presence of these cowbirds, with meadowlarks fledging early, dickcissels slowing their growth, but only in these nests with a lot of competition, and the grasshopper sparrows appear to be compensating for the presence of cowbirds in some way, as we found no effect of cowbirds on any of the metrics of grasshopper sparrow growth. So we kind of explored this relationship, this direct effect of brood parasitism on growth and development. So now I was interested in seeing how brood parasitism may affect growth and development indirectly by interacting with food availability and predator risk. So cowbirds beg very frequently. That's one of the ways that they've adapted to this brood parasitism strategy. So this little cowbird nesting you see here with its red mouth has its mouth open constantly compared to the dickcissels in the nest. So this frequent begging could increase the provisioning rate. Maybe the parents are super stimulated by seeing these begging birds. They bring more food per capita to the nestlings. Alternatively, maybe it affects predation risk. So maybe these predators, like racers that we know can hear begging birds, maybe they are hearing these cowbirds begging more frequently, and so these nests with cowbirds are riskier for these host nestlings. And because we saw some effects of direct competition, we wanted to include this direct competition in these models as well. So we ran sets of structural equation models for each species, looking at the number of nestlings, number of cowbird nestlings, their effect on provisioning rate, predation risk, and growth. And we also included brood size because we know that brood size can affect provisioning rate and might affect growth. We didn't expect there to be a relationship between the number of cowbird nestlings and brood size, as we thought that these birds are replacing nestlings. So kicking out an egg instead of actually adding an additional nestling to the nest. We looked at 3 different response variables of growth. We looked at just overall mass gain. We looked, now we're not using these principal components, we're looking instead just at like the actual measurements of tarsus divided by mass. So looking at prioritization of tarsus, and then the prioritization of wing growth. So we had to calculate provisioning rates. So we turned to that subset of nests for which we had this nest footage. And unfortunately, as you can see here, we often see the back of the bird. So you're looking at the back of a grasshopper sparrow female, you can't see who she's feeding in the nest. Sometimes you can, like this male, you could tell what nestling he's feeding, but we couldn't always do that. So instead we calculated provisioning rate as the number of visits per hour. We had to watch all this footage, just like you are right now, to calculate this in the first year, which was a lot. Luckily for the second year, we found this program called Deep Meerkat, which uses machine learning to take still images where motion occurs. So we would get thousands of photos to sift through instead of actual video to help us calculate these provisioning rates. We ended up analyzing over 1,000 hours of the footage that we had gathered. We saw like about 3,500 provisioning visits overall. And when I say we, I mean this amazing crew of students that has helped in the lab for the last 2 years. So they are wonderful, and we definitely would not have been able to do this project without them. And to calculate predation risk, I didn't want to look at the actual predation. I wanted to look at basically try to assess what the birds think the predation risk is. You know, if predation risk is altering their behavior, I want to know what the birds are experiencing. So the best thing to do would be to go out and look at the actual density of these predators on the prairie, but that would mean a whole other project where we're like chasing snakes and coyotes around or something like that. So instead what I did is I graphed all of the locations of depredated nests in the last 2 years, and I used a kernel density estimation to calculate the density of depredated nests per hectare on the prairie. So then I could take a location of a nest, run it through this map, and extract the risk value, which is just the density of nests that were eaten by a predator. And this includes the nests that were totally destroyed by a predator, but also the nests where a predator came and took like 1 or 2 eggs, which does happen. So again, as I mentioned before, we have this large interspecific variation in mass gain, not only in the meadowlarks, but also in the smaller hosts, the grasshopper sparrows and the dickcissels. So we expected that this mass gain could be related to direct competition. So I'm going to use throughout this whole section red dashed lines to indicate a negative relationship, and blue solid lines, which I'll show you, to indicate a positive relationship. But basically we thought that as you increase the number of cowbird nestlings, you would see reduced mass gain. So these birds would be competing with the hosts. If this direct competition is happening, they wouldn't be gaining mass as fast. As I mentioned before, we could only put video cameras up at a subset of nests. So we did all of these analyses on all of our nestlings, and then included a second set of analyses where we could look at provisioning rate on just the subset that had data for the provisioning rate. So for that group, we expect to see a positive relationship between the number of nestlings and provisioning rate, because as these cowbirds are begging more frequently, they'd induce parents to bring more food to the nest. We'd expect that to have a positive influence on mass gain then, where we'd expect these birds to grow faster if they're receiving more food. And indeed, we know that as the number of nestlings increase, the parents visit the nest more frequently. So if you have 8 nestlings, they're coming to the nest with food, 6 times per hour instead of 2 times per hour. However, this adjustment doesn't actually keep per capita provisioning rates up. So if you divide the total visits by the brood size, you see that the number of visits that each nestling receives at the nest is actually reduced as you increase the brood size in a nest. So the parents can compensate a little bit for more nestlings by bringing more food, but not enough to give the nestlings the same amount of food. So for meadowlarks, we thought that, we found that when predation risk increased, mass gain increased, not this cowbird to mass relationship that we expected. This could be because a lot of our predators have relatively small mouths. So this is a speckled king snake, and it's trying to eat this nestling here in the corner, but it's having problems like fitting it in its mouth. We actually have camera footage of predators coming to the nest, failing to eat the nestlings because they're too big and leaving. So it could be that gaining mass is important for these meadowlarks in order to avoid predation, just because gaining mass would make them larger and harder for the predator to eat. When we included the provisioning rate, we actually found the opposite effect. So as predation risk increased, mass gain decreased. Now remember, this is with a smaller data set, so that could be part of the problem, or potentially this just isn't a very strong relationship. But no effect of cowbirds, basically. So for tick thistles, when we looked at all the nests, we didn't find any relationship. When we looked at the provisioning nests, we found that as provisioning rate increased, the nestlings gained mass faster, which you'd expect. More food per nestling, they could grow faster. We didn't find that direct relationship between the number of cowbird nestlings and provisioning rate that we expected. Instead, we found this sort of like sideways route where the number of cowbird nestlings increased the brood size, which again, we didn't expect because we thought they were replacing nestlings. But the nests with more cowbirds had bigger broods, but that in turn reduced the provisioning rate, as you saw before. This is the per capita provisioning rate. So there might be a relationship here between cowbirds and provisioning rate, but it's not in the direction we anticipated. They're not increasing the provisioning rate and increasing mass gain for these tick thistles. For the tiny grasshopper sparrows, we found that with increasing brood size, they had reduced mass gain, which you'd expect if there's more nestlings in the brood competing, less food to go around. You can see that here. This blue dotted line are nests with 1 or 2 nestlings, and they're growing mass faster, gaining mass faster than nestlings in nests with 3 to 4 or 5 or more nestlings. When we included the provisioning rate data, we found an effect of cowbirds on provisioning rate. So that the nests with more cowbirds had higher provisioning rates. Parents were bringing more food per nestling as we expected, but that didn't influence mass gain. And again, we had a small sample size here. Unfortunately, we had cameras on only 3 parasitized sparrow nests. So the vast majority of this data is from non-parasitized nests, unfortunately. So there might be a pattern there, but we don't have the data to make any strong conclusions about it. So the presence of cowbirds overall was not directly related to mass gain, and it wasn't indirectly related to mass gain through some interaction with provisioning rate. Moving on to tarsus now. So the bird's tarsus prioritization, again, is just tarsus divided by mass. You can see variation here in the species. We expected that as the number of cowbird nestlings increased, that these birds would dedicate more energy to growing their tarsus so that they could stand up and compete with these cowbirds. We expected, again, that the number of cowbird nestlings would increase the provisioning rate, and that would kind of release this competition from the nestlings in the brood. So, if they're still receiving the same amount of food, they wouldn't need to prioritize their tarsus anymore. So we'd see no change, or more likely this negative relationship. Meadowlarks, we found that as the number of cowbird nestlings increased, tarsus prioritization decreased, again, the opposite of what we expected here, and that there was also a negative impact of predation risk. So in the riskier nests, these birds grew their mass more than their tarsus. And so you see that here, where parasitized birds hatch with slightly larger tarsi relative to their mass, but that declines more steeply over time as they're dedicating more energy to gaining mass versus gaining their tarsus length. It could be that this higher mass is more important than tarsi for competition with the cowbirds. We've been thinking that standing the tallest was the most important, but it could just be that these really chunky, large, high mass meadowlarks can knock around cowbirds in what we call scrambled competition. So maybe mass is what we should have been looking at when assessing competition between nestlings. Or alternatively, maybe tarsus is most affected by stress. So in stressful situations, like having a lot of predators or having a lot of cowbirds, the effect that we see on the nestlings would be a reduction in tarsus growth. So it isn't prioritization relative to mass at all. It's just that tarsi are growing slower when these birds are in some sort of stressful situation. So a few alternative explanations for that. When we include the provisioning behavior, we still saw this negative effect of predation risk on tarsus prioritization, no longer an effect of cowbirds. For dickcissels, we found that as brood size increased, tarsus prioritization decreased. Again, the opposite of what you'd predict, as you'd think that larger brood size would mean that you need to prioritize this tarsus more. When we included the provisioning data, the relationship we had instead was that these birds prioritize their tarsus more in riskier environments. So when predation risk was higher, these birds grew their tarsus more than their mass. This was affected by cowbirds. So as the number of cowbirds in the nest increased, so did predation risk, which is pretty neat. We found the same pattern for sparrows. So we hadn't anticipated that there'd be any interaction with predation risk and tarsus prioritization at all, if you remember those predictions. So it's kind of intriguing as to what's going on here, but it could just be that these birds are capable of leaving the nest before they can fly. So if you're a little nestling running out of the nest when a predator comes, you would need longer legs and more developed legs to escape those predators. So again, maybe tarsus isn't an indicator of competition like we expected, but it's instead an indicator of mobility, where these birds, with long tarsi can escape predators most often. That effect goes away in the few nests for which we have provisioning data for grasshopper sparrows. So overall, the presence of cowbirds is not related to the prioritization of competitive features directly. And there's a question now of whether these tarsus or these tarsi measurements are actually indicative of any sort of competition. And they don't seem to be interacting with provisioning rate and affecting tarsus prioritization that way, like we expected. Finally, we looked at the prioritization of feather growth. So these values, higher values means more feather growth relative to their mass. And as you can see, they grow feathers over time, so there's also an age effect there. So we expected here that the number of cowbird nestlings would increase predation risk, as before, but now that predation risk would increase wing prioritization, expecting that, if more predators are around, these birds are going to want to leave the nest earlier, would dedicate more energy to growing those wings. We found no relationship at all for meadowlarks in either analysis. Nothing seemed to be affecting the feather size relative to mass for meadowlarks. For dickcissels, we saw the opposite of what we predicted, where we expected that predation risk would increase feather size, but it's the other way around. When we looked at just the provisioning rate data, that disappeared. Sparrows, we saw the exact same pattern with dickcissels, where increased risk meant decreased prioritization of wings, which could be, again, explained by the fact that these birds are potentially not using wings to counter predation. So if they're focusing on their tarsus, we'd expect potentially their wing size would be reduced. And you can see that here, where the grasshopper sparrows in these low-risk nests, in this bluish dotted line, over time ends up growing their tarsus more relative to mass than the birds in the high-risk nests. When we included that provisioning data, we had an effective brood size, where the more nestlings you had in the nest, the lower your feather scores were, which could be a competition thing. I'm not totally sure, but not what we predicted either way. So the presence of cowbirds did not relate to the prioritization of feather growth to avoid this predation risk. So overall, we found no evidence that cowbirds increase provisioning rates across the board, although grasshopper sparrows do appear to have a relationship there that would be great if we could explore with more data. Cowbirds don't seem to increase predation risk across the board, and that doesn't appear to affect the structures we thought it would anyway. And we didn't find a lot of evidence, again, that these birds are directly competing with host nestlings, even now that we're addressing it with different measures of growth. So this whole indirect effects section, basically we found no evidence of these indirect effects that we were anticipating. We did find that hosts are responding to the presence of cowbirds in different ways, like host-specific responses. So we know from before that these meadowlarks are reducing fledge age. They're also gaining mass in nests with cowbirds. Grasshopper sparrows are provisioning more. We're seeing these different responses to this from these very similar members of the community. And finally, we found that this growth and development did respond to variation at the nest level, which is pretty incredible. Again, like we didn't even think as a field that there was interspecific variation in the development of nestlings before, let alone that it could be responding to something as fine scale as the predation risk at an individual nest location. But we do see some effects on that. It's just not related to cowbirds like we anticipated. So we saw this really neat effect of the variation on growth, but within species, we didn't necessarily see a lot of variation in these drivers themselves. So meadowlarks didn't have a very high variation in their provisioning rate. Or grasshopper sparrows didn't necessarily vary much in their predation risk nest to nest. A little bit more variation in brood size, but dick thistles were talking a difference of 1 or 2 nestlings for most of the nests. So it'd be really neat if we could address the effect of these drivers in a species that has a wider variety of these responses. So a species that encounters a wider range of predation risks. And luckily, we have a species that was in each of these different nests that was encountering this whole scale of variation, and that's our brown-headed cowbirds. So the cowbirds themselves are an excellent system to try to use to disentangle this effect of the environment on growth and development. And like the host species, they vary too. So if you look at cowbird mass gain overall, you see some variation as they age. So we basically wanted to model these relationships in a very similar way, where we're looking at the effect of provisioning rate on growth, brood size on growth, and predation risk on growth. This time, though, instead of looking at the effect of the number of cowbirds, we'll be looking at the host species identity, because we know that provisioning rate, brood size, and predation risk do vary by host. So we hypothesized the exact same things. We thought that provisioning rate increases would lead to more mass gain as these birds get more food. We thought as they compete with more members of a brood, they would see reduced mass gain. And then, of course, we expected that there would be a host species effect on all of that. We found the host species effect. We didn't find any difference on mass gain. So provisioning rate didn't impact mass gain, brood size didn't, predation risk didn't. This is really intriguing because it did matter for the hosts. So hosts were affected by things like provisioning rate or brood size or predation risk. Yet these cowbirds that are in the exact same nests experiencing the exact same provisioning rate variation do not. We looked then at tarsus, and we expected the same things we did before, that the more food you get, the less you have to prioritize the growth of your tarsus to compete. Again, this is before we started thinking about other parts of the body being used for competition. And then we expected as brood size increased, you need to compete more, have longer legs. We expected all of this to be impacted by the host species. We did find an impact of provisioning rate on tarsus in the opposite direction, where the birds that receive more food end up growing their tarsus more relative to their mass. So it could just be that food is a limiting factor for tarsus growth, that the birds that receive less food just can't grow their tarsus to the full extent that they could if they received more food. And maybe that's why we're seeing this, because we're not sure how that would relate to competition. And so here's that graph where we see that the birds that receive the highest provisioning, interestingly, have smaller tarsi relative to mass at throughout their whole life, but that slope decreases a little less over time. So they're still continuing to put more energy into growing their tarsus relative to mass, more so than those species in nests with lower per capita provisioning rates. And lastly, we looked at wing growth, just like we did with hosts. We expected that predation risk would increase wing growth prioritization in the hope of escaping a predator, that this would be related to host species. And we found nothing, no relationship between any of the drivers and wing prioritization for these cowbird nestlings, which again is really intriguing because we saw effects of predation risk on hosts and provisioning rate on hosts and brood size on hosts between the 3 hosts and nothing for these cowbirds. When we looked at fledge age, there was an effect of hosts, kind of how you'd expect. So meadowlark hosts stay in the nest longer than dick thistles or grasshopper sparrows, and so do cowbirds, but it doesn't mirror it exactly. So meadowlark host nestlings will fledge about day 10.5 on average. These cowbirds fledge a little bit earlier than that. Dick thistles fledge at about day 7.3. The cowbirds are leaving at least a day later on average from dick thistle nests. And sparrows fledge at about day 7.2 and are leaving a couple days earlier or thereabouts on average. So it seems as if cowbirds would prefer to fledge somewhere in here, right? So they want to stick around in the nest a little bit longer than the host species, even after the host species leave, but maybe a little bit less so than the meadowlarks. And some sort of optimum in the middle is where we think these cowbirds would be leaving normally. One last little bit that I unfortunately don't have time to go into, we're kind of interested in how this related to which host the cowbirds chose. So these dickcissel nests are parasitized 3 times more frequently than the other host species. And we kind of expected, maybe these cowbirds grow the best in dickcissel nests, or maybe they have, the best mass gain or fledge earliest or something. But that wasn't the case at all. We didn't see any host species effect on growth and development that would be beneficial for these birds. So instead, it's probably, these nests are just easier to find. So dickcissels have these big open cup nests. The other 2 have domed nests. So all the hypotheses about, cowbirds prioritizing parasitism of, the best possible host for their offspring may not be playing out here, because they may just be choosing the nest that they can find the most frequently. So overall, cowbirds are exposed to very different environments, a much wider range of these drivers than host nestlings, but that has little effect on growth that we can see. We see a lot of variation, it's just not related to any of the drivers. There's a lot of ways that this could happen. So perhaps the cowbird parents, before they lay the eggs, are varying the amount of hormones or resources they have and optimizing those eggs for the different environments so that they grow about the same no matter what. They might be responding to drivers at different levels. So these sparrows or meadowlarks are looking at their own individual territories, and they would know the predation risk and everything really well there, versus these cowbirds are traveling all across the prairie looking for their hosts. So maybe they just don't have the knowledge of that particular nest that the host parents do, and so they don't allocate resources in the same way. Or the cowbirds may be manipulating the hosts. So maybe they're creating the environmental variation that they need to grow the best by altering things like provisioning rate or something. And that would allow them to grow similar ways in different hosts with different environmental drivers. And cowbird's fledge age, as I mentioned, was dependent on the host, but it doesn't necessarily mirror it directly. And they appear to choose hosts based on availability, not their survival or their growth and development. So what does this all mean? Like, why did we spend a couple of years running around the prairie 7 days a week, measuring host nestlings from April till August? In a lot of species, you just inherently think of environmental drivers affecting growth and development. So if you think of turtles, you may know that turtles, if they experience different temperatures, will actually develop into different sexes. So the environmental variation experienced by these developing offspring is really, really important for the rest of their lives. We didn't assume that as songbird biologists. That's not really something that we think of when we think about our birds. So we found that, like turtles, these birds have variable growth and development strategies, and that allows them to respond to environmental variation. We were surprised still by the magnitude of this. So, at Kansa, all these birds are in very similar environments. There may not be a lot of variation in the predation risk or provisioning behavior, as opposed to some environment where there's a lot of environmental variation in these drivers. And yet, even with little variation, we still see a huge magnitude of interspecific variation, where you have nestlings that are twice the size of their conspecifics 6 days after they hatch, which is really, really neat. We also found that these hosts that were historically hosts of the brown-headed cowbird are capable of raising cowbirds now with few consequences to their growth and development strategies, at least for the nestlings. This is interesting because, again, where these cowbirds are expanding into the east and the west coast, they're really negatively impacting the development and the well-being of these species and their populations. And so it's neat to find that there's like species-specific adaptations to the presence of cowbirds that we don't see because we're only focused on the birds that haven't evolved with cowbirds. And finally, despite sharing a nest, these cowbirds and their hosts don't respond to the same drivers of growth and development variation in the same ways. So you can have organisms of different species developing in very, very similar environments. And we found that you can't make assumptions about how one will develop based on another. Because again, these cowbirds are experiencing the exact same variation. They're in the exact same nest, and they're not responding the same way to this environmental variation. So, we found this diversity in growth and development strategies. We have identified some of the environmental drivers that affect it. This is important in general because I think the biggest take home that we found was that these are really species specific. So meadowlarks respond to predation risk differently than dickcissels, differently than cowbirds. And so when we're thinking about the ways that changing environments can affect birds or any other individual through this like diversity in growth and development, we can't make any sort of assumptions about how one species will respond based on what we know from the study. So if you were looking at, two different grassland birds, these are the same clade of individuals, they rely on very similar habitats, they might respond to changes in those habitats in very different ways with very different impacts on their survival, which is something that we were surprised by. So I'd like to thank a lot of people. As Alice mentioned, we've had some success with fundings. We had a few small grants from Southwestern Association of Naturalists, BGSA, Sigma Xi, Sunset Zoo. Then of course our primary funding was through the National Science Foundation and Kanza, and a ton of support from Kanza in general. So thank you all. Also support from the Division of Biology, especially administration. The folks downstairs who help me every single time I have a funding problem or a paperwork problem have been instrumental in keeping me here. Bob, who sets up everything from our presentations to helping me every time GIS crashes. The cleaning staff that makes my office like more livable than it would be. I don't know if it's like up to the standards of my office mates yet, but the graduate school folks that help manage my funding through NSF, members of my committee, Dr. Tobler and Dr. Rhodes, who have been really, really patient with me as I've missed all my deadlines. All of this data collection was only possible because of amazing field crews. So over the last 2 years, I had some great individuals working with me, and I couldn't be more grateful for all their help finding these nests, helping me measure nestlings, things like that. Boyle Lab in general has been amazing. So I wouldn't have gotten through the last 3 to 5 years without the support of my lab mates. We've been on all sorts of fun adventures from canoeing to mountain climbing. I'm also including in this Robert, who is an honorary member of our lab and who is the first person I call when something breaks, as he has managed to do everything from rewire our cameras to make them more efficient to like helping with car problems and things like that. Also acknowledge the people that have helped support me in my mental health over the last 5 years, especially my therapist and my psychiatrist. Being a person with bipolar disorder and doing good science is hard, so having their help has been instrumental. And of course, my family members for helping me through all of this. And I couldn't have done it without all of my friends here in the graduate college, and I can't put all of your faces on here, so here's a few of my many friends who have supported me and some of the interesting adventures we have been on. And finally, as Alice mentioned, I was a wee baby of 19 years old when I joined this lab. I had never done an independent research project before. I'd never been to Kansas before. I'd never lived outside of a dorm before. So over the last 5 years, Alice has been really instrumental in not only helping me grow as a scientist, but as a person. We've been on a lot of fun birding adventures, and she's helped me, do SciComm outreach for students and just other crazy adventures in general. So I wouldn't be the same person if it wasn't for my time here in Alice's lab, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. With that, I will take any questions.
So I apologize because you might have covered this. You went over a lot of data. So if you said this, please already answer that question. My fault. You did a great job of illustrating the consequences of having cowbirds in the nest on the other developing nestlings. But is it possible to actually assess the consequences of having cowbirds in the nest on the adults? Do they live a shorter amount of time? Is their like physiology lower? Like I imagine having them in there is terrible as a parent. So is there a parental cost to like having them?
I think a lot of what we see as like compensation, the nestlings aren't developing differently. It's maybe because of parental changes in behavior. These birds are hard to catch. So going out and taking continual measurements of them is really frustrating. But I expect there is like a major difference, and I will punt that because I think some of my other lab mates will be studying that in the next few years, and I will let them answer that question once we know for sure what's happening up there, assuming we can catch the parents over and over, which is a pain.
I'm going to also apologize because I don't know anything about birds. That was maybe a silly question, but you talked a little bit about phylogeny a little bit at the very end. Do you think that plays a role in some of how the different species of hosts responded to the cowbirds? Like, is there this expectation that closely related species the cowbirds would respond like differently than ones that were sort of distantly related?
I don't have a large enough sample size to address that, but it has been looked at in some other studies where they're looking at something like blackbirds and seeing how they raise the cowbirds. And overall, the vast majority of the studies have found no relationship between the responses to the cowbirds and the genetic relatedness of those hosts to the cowbirds. Most of the time, it kind of comes down to this idea of host size. It'd be very interesting to figure out. We would just need to study like something like red-winged blackbirds that are very closely related to cowbirds, but don't nest in the same density type concept.
So I can imagine like competition in the nest could even be so bad for some of the nestlings that they might even like die or starve or otherwise succumb. Did you, with your nestling measurements, only include the ones that actually made it all the way to the end, or did you see any effects of like cowbirds being there actually did outcompete them in the actual growth rates, but maybe just in survival?
Yeah, so we wanted to study the all of the nestlings, but we didn't want to measure every single one because we didn't want to disturb the nest that frequently. So the first day we went out to the nest, we grabbed 2 nestlings at random, and we measured those 2 over the course of their development. So I can't say, of all of the nestlings, they were not competed by cowbirds. But I can say anecdotally, in all the time I've been at Cons, I've only ever found a single starved nestling in the nest, like a dead host nestling. And that nestling hatched days after the cowbird, so it was substantially smaller than that cowbird. I kind of expected that there would be a cost to competition in survival, but the presence of cowbird eggs or nestlings didn't affect survival of any of these nests when you ran like nest success models. So while it may impact individuals, we didn't get a really clear signal of that, which again was surprising because the narrative is always cowbird's bad. So the fact that we didn't see that to the extent that we thought was surprising.
Yeah, Sarah, this is great work. I'm trying to wrap my mind around the scale at which predation risk occurs, right? So you sort of measured it at the scale of the nest. And, but it's sort of predation risk is one of those things, even if it's low, if a snake wanders by and, assuming they can get you in your mouth, you're done. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if predation risk, thinking of how it would affect the morphology, which might be an evolutionary response. Do you think you have a large enough scale, or would it be better to go to a site where like there was no snakes, farther away and really measure that?
Yeah, I would say yes. We took this predation risk metric thinking that it wouldn't have as large of an effect as it did, especially because we're not sure how birds perceive predation, right? It's hard to get into birds' heads. So to answer those questions, we actually have colleagues who are taking the very same measurements at different sites. So we have people out in Western Kansas where they're experiencing different predation rates and parasitism risks. And I've got some data from Southern Illinois. I know from the group in Wisconsin, they have no snakes, which is our top nest predator, and their sparrows are leaving like 6 days later than our sparrows. So I think if I had to guess, like our initial assumption was that this predation risk, any effects of that would be happening at a broader scale than at the nest level. So it's interesting that we found that effect, and it'll be really neat to dig into those other nests and see the true extent to which that variation will matter. That'll be a fun side project this summer.
So I had a question about those, the growth rate graphs that you showed. So, if you were able to measure these things into adulthood, it probably would be like a logistic sort of curve, right? So I'm wondering, on those curves that you showed, was that, where along the curve was that, multi-day sort of stretch of increase?
So in general, birds grow in a logistic manner like he's describing, where you would see, these birds growing really quickly and then kind of hitting a plateau where they'd stop. And so most studies of nesting development don't actually look at linear models. They look at a logistic curve that they fit to the data. And then they'll take like the inflection point and look at how that varies from environmental drivers. But as I showed, we see a basically linear effect. So I think we're just at the very beginning of that curve where, they're starting to ramp up a little bit. It looks basically linear. You can model it linearly. And then once they leave the nest, they're probably developing a little bit more and hitting that peak. But it was surprising, and it makes it really frustrating to compare what we have to other studies because we don't have logistically growing birds at this point in their life. But I assume that they're not so weird, but they're not going to do that at some point.
This might be a pretty random question, but you mentioned that takes us all the male for the nestlings are bigger. Do you know if any way responding to like parasitism risk, they have more male nestlings in the nest than female nestlings?
So sex ratio doesn't vary, at least at this site, based on nests. So you could expect maybe if the females are smaller that they'd be outcompeted more by males, and so or by cowbirds, you'd end up with more male dickcissels. But sex ratios don't change at all. Interestingly, we did see some variation in cowbird sex ratios, which we expected them to be a little bit more sexually dimorphic than they were, but we did see more females in the smaller host nests. So maybe if the birds can choose to lay females or males, they're laying their least competitive option in the nest where competition won't matter as much. But yeah, it would be, I don't know if we see enough variation in the dickcissels for that to actually like affect survival or something like that, but it is measurable between males and females.
It's really cool, the kernel density of the risk. Was that just the number of depredated nests in the landscape?
Yeah.
How do you think that compares to a kernel density of like all the nests on the landscape?
So like just overall density?
Yeah.
It doesn't map directly. So my undergrad work was on the density of these birds, so I have the same maps. So it isn't just that there's more predators and more depredated nests in areas where there are more nests. But certainly that would affect it a little bit. But also you may just have more risk. If you're a predator, would you be searching in nests, searching for nests in areas where there are not a lot of birds or in areas where there are a lot of birds? So I'm not sure if the fact that it's not completely independent from the density of nests is a bad thing necessarily. But yes, where predators are does vary. It's not just like at all nests.
I have one more specific question. So in your SEM with the cowbirds, how did you treat host species identity? Was it like as categories or?
Yeah, so I kept it categorical, and I used, I used a piecewise SEM package that can, at least the guy claims it can account for categorical variables. So that's how I address that, hopefully.
All right. Well, thank you once again, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Sarah.